I think so. We're live? Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Nathalie Donier, the chair of Eurosif, and I will be moderating today's discussion. So the event is taking place in the European Parliament, but is also publicly streamed online to a wider audience, and the number keeps increasing. We are nearly 100 people online. Online participants are welcome to ask questions in the chat for the Q&A that will take place after the panel discussion. I would like to thank warmly MEPs Gerbrandy, Niedermayer, Wolters, and Peter-Hansen for hosting us today. So the event will start with a short introduction by MEPs Gerbrandy and Niedermayer, and will be followed by a panel discussion. We will then have a Q&A, and we will conclude by words from MEP Wolters and Peter-Hansen. So now I will leave the floor to MEPs Gerbrandy and Niedermayer for their intervention.
Well, thank you so much, Nathalie, and thank you for organizing this event together with us, for MEPs that will be here. And it's a great pleasure to discuss the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation with people who not just understand, but even sleep about TRIPS and Scope 1 and Level 2 and PAIs. I think if you walk on the street and ask people what that is, nobody would know. And I didn't know a few months ago myself. So it's wonderful to be here. And your timing is really great, because we are currently in the process of trying to come to compromises. There we can also use some expertise advice that will come to us today. I won't be very long, but I have a few remarks and a few questions that I would like to make. First of all, is that we started with a very good Commission proposal, and that's not always the case. So I was very happy with that. We all knew that review of the SFDR was very badly needed, and the Commission did a good job. They simplified it, they made it more accessible to investors, and hopefully it's also a better prevention of greenwashing, the new proposal. Nevertheless, we are stubborn people, politicians, so I did believe that it was possible to improve it there. And we've seen from Council that they had the same idea, and that they I think found a pretty good balance in making a few things slightly stronger and a few other things more less strict. My main objective as rapporteur is to keep the SFDR 2.0 a credible piece of legislation. And what I mean with credible is that those investors, and we're primarily focusing on retail investors here, who do want to invest responsibly, that they can rely on this piece of legislation. That if they want to invest in a green product or a social product, and they follow the lines of the SFDR, that they are really served in the way that what they're looking for. And I think that is a very important target and objective for me. Also, general remark, it's important, and I also said that when I, for the first time, presented my draft in committee, that it's good to understand what the SFDR is about and what it's not. And also for politicians dealing with this is not telling people how to invest. No, not at all. But it's a tool, a transparency tool that makes it easier for people to make the choices that they want to make. And therefore, simplification is also so important, because with the very, very long reporting obligations in the previous SFDR, that simply did not work in daily life. So to finalize with a few questions to the panel, and that might be helpful for our work in Parliament. The first is on the principal adverse impact indicators. And it's clear that there is a trade-off between ensuring comparability between the different products, but also not overburdening the financial market participants with a lot of reporting requirements, or overwhelming the investors with too much information. And that balance is, in that balance, the PAIs are very crucial. And my question to the panel would be, how many do you think do we need? Do we have to prescribe them? Which ones do you believe are usable and useful, and which ones are not? My second question is on the scope of SFDR, very important, and that relates to the so-called packaged retail and insurance-based investment products, the famous PRIPS. And I want to avoid that them not being part of SFDR, that we do not get green claims coming from them that will be unclear to people who want to buy them. So the Council has this solution for asking the Commission to come up with a proposal within 5 years. But my question is, should they be part of the scope already or not? Thirdly, basically the same question that's about professional investors. Should it be in scope or not? And finally, a problem that arises in many discussions that I have, that is the availability of data. And we will rely a lot on estimates at the moment. And so the question is, how can we improve that? Should we regulate data providers and their methodologies? And how should we do that? And how can we protect the asset managers with these data providers? So those are the 4 questions that I would like to put to the panel, and I'm very much looking forward to the coming hour. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me and organizing this event. It's easy to talk after Rapporteur because I guess Jan said almost everything. Let me just add few remarks. The first, that the file is also not about telling firms what they should do. It's their decision. If they want to do fossil fuel, they do fossil fuel within the scope of regulation. If they want to be very green, they can be very green. The asset manager, fund managers can decide if they want to put on the market very green products or products that are not green at all. And it should be understood. So we are not here telling the firms what they should do. We are just helping people that have money to decide how to invest. So this is very important. I have a similar observation as Jan, that when I took the file, and before I applied for the file, I just look at how it is, and I was impressed that it seems it was very well prepared. There is a very strong case for moving from 1.0 to 2.0 because the first one failed in some aspects, and I guess Commission took pretty good approach, very open approach, talking to industry, considering different options and so on. But still, like Jan said, it doesn't mean that it's trivial to find the agreement. You know? And this is our work. I would just add to your list of the question or remarks my two things that were in the center of our attention. The first one was how to interpret transitional group, what it should be. And here I guess that the main thing is that I'm setting these 3 groups, and the 4th group, that means those that are outside of these 3 groups, one cannot say that more is more and less is less. So it's not easy to say if you want to have if you will have very open definition that basically almost everyone gets in, that it loses the relevance. If it is something like really fantastic, notch market 0.000 something, that is completely irrelevant. And transitional is a big trick because for someone, transitional is basically sustainable, that is just a little bit less sustainable. Someone is just arguing that transitional is that one that is maybe not fantastic, but is making big effort how to make it much better. But then you are confronted with the problem that legislation is normally a pretty static thing. So how to include the dynamism into that? So this was one of the questions that I'm still struggling, how to look at transitional category. And the second coming from EPP group, I was pretty happy about Commission effort to simplify things, to focus on the disclosure commitments that are the most relevant for overall result, and we were pretty happy about it. And we have here a little bit kind of disagreement, but I hope we will find some common ground how to get files through, implement quickly, and make it better for the industry to comply and for the investors to decide how to invest.
Thank you very much. Before we move to the panel, as we are the 1st of July today, and basically the Ireland will take the presidency of the Council. I would like maybe to ask Sorka Keok, who is the financial attaché at the Irish Permanent Representation, to brief us on the priorities of the Irish presidency of the Council in the future for the future trilogue discussions.
Yeah, so I'm one of the financial services attachés here in the rep. All things banking sit on my side. So digitally, banking competitiveness, and SFDR all sit with me. And as you say, it's the 1st of July, so we are in presidency mode now. So we are Europe's honest broker. So I'm going to be as neutral as I can. I'm sure you'll see a lot of these around Brussels during the day. But for SFDR, I think we are ambitious on the file. I think we'd look to get it closed in our term. And I think we are looking very much forward to working with the Parliament to have trilogues as soon as all sides are ready. So I'll keep it very short, but looking very much forward to the file.
Thank you very much. So today, as you said, we are the 1st of July. On June 24th, the Council has reached an agreement on its negotiating mandate for the file. And meanwhile, the European Parliament is actively reviewing the proposal with over 600 amendments currently tabled, so which reflect the engagement of policymakers and the open question that still, I would say, lays around disclosure-based system categorization, moving from a disclosure-based system to a categorization framework consisting of sustainable transition and ESG basics product. So our objective today is to explore how this proposed architecture align with market realities, institutional assets allocation, and retail distribution. So in the panel today, we have European investors and stakeholders. We have Erik Peter-Hansen, who is the head of responsible investment at Nordea Asset Management. We have Louise Schreiber, I was trying to locate you, who is the head of the sustainability research on listed assets at Mirova. We have Piotr Lwiszowski, Asset Management CEO and CIO at Poland Development Fund Asset Management. We have Piet Klopp, who is Director of Strategic Relations at PGGM, Pension Investors in the Netherlands. And we have Julia Simon, Head of Research and Advocacy at Finance Watch. So I will start with Pete for my first question. So looking at the overarching architecture of the Commission proposal, from the perspective of a large asset owner, do you welcome the changes? And will this new framework help shifting capital to sustainable investment?
Yeah, the last question is the most important one, I think. Will it actually move the money? But we're pretty happy with what we see. You know, the title of this panel is Getting It Right. We think the Commission got it right by and large. As to the earlier question, whether or not we should be under the SFDR as a institutional investor, we're wired slightly differently than retail investors, obviously. But it is important for us. And it's important mostly because we want to communicate to our participants, our pension fund beneficiaries, what happens with their money in terms that are comparable across the industry. And what we like about the proposal is that the 70% for ESG basics is a very important part, because as an institutional investor, you do a little bit of everything. You can't possibly get above 70%, given all the illiquid investments, the treasuries, all the things that don't quite lend themselves to an ESG approach. So 70% is good. Don't change it. The other thing is, don't change our ability to communicate about all the things we do by way of transition investments or sustainable investments, impact investments. We can't aim higher than ESG basics across the entire pension fund, but for individual strategies, we are very proud to aim a whole lot higher. And the key for us here is that we try to capture the real world impact of those investments. So, the focus really ought to be what real world change do these investments make? And then maybe a little point that is important to us too. The scope of the sustainability financial disclosure itself may be something. I don't want to start moving the goalposts already, but there's a big discussion also within organizations like PGGM, whether or not we should do more for European strategic autonomy beyond sustainability, that is. Or perhaps it's within sustainability if you broadly define the concept. So what is the thing we want to transition towards to? What is indeed the most desirable type of investment is something that we'd be interested in continuing the discussion. Is this helpful? Yes, it is very helpful, especially because the simplification that we've seen since SFDR 1.0, which, to be perfectly blunt, we all hated. Because it seemed to be missing the point, it gave us so much forms to fill out without moving the money. So that is something we want to recapture. The whole idea behind it should be to move the money to where it is needed. It does a good job there. So yes, we're very much in support of this. We also support the whole idea that we can't water it down. We need to have a credible framework. So I'm not asking here for an opt-out, allowing us to talk, grandiose claims about what we do beyond ESG basics. We want to stick to the straight and narrow there too. But we feel a little bit dispirited, perhaps, that we're just ESG basics, even though we think we do a whole lot more.
Thank you. And this is us discussing the structure and criteria of the categories. To qualify for these categories, product must meet specific criteria, including a positive contribution to sustainability objective or feature, minimum exclusion, and specific disclosure. So we will explore these criteria, how these criteria translate to practical implementation across different strategies and region. So I will start with you, Louise. From Miroval's perspective, does the proposed criteria make sense? For example, there is a lot of debate on the positive contribution threshold. We heard 70% is good. So do you share that view? What percentage you think is relevant? And are the proposed eligible approaches relevant across different asset class and social perspective?
Sure. So 70% strikes the right balance, actually, in multiple terms. So firstly, we think it's going to be efficient in terms of fighting against greenwashing. Maintaining a 100% level has been very difficult in recent time. The largest capitalization come from countries where regulation and transparency is lower. Companies have not been transitioning fast enough. So we are faced today with difficulties in constraining our sustainable investment portfolios or most impact portfolio at 100% level. 70% level means that we can still be massively oriented towards the most sustainable companies, but have some leeway for performance and diversification. But below 70% would create the risk of hurting the credibility. We think our clients will aim for more than half of their investment matching the standards that we have promised, right? So it's the right balance between creating the temptation to maybe stretch a little too much the notion of sustainable investment to match the 100% level, and yet, be diversified and be credible.
Thank you. Some amendments in the European Parliament propose to establish minimum social and governance safeguards across categories. Do you think this would be helpful?
Very much. We actually already do that. Right now, the notion of doing no significant harm is transversal, capturing environmental, social, and governance aspects. Moving to a PAB alignment sort of criteria would put a lot of focus on the environmental, constraints or limitation, minimum standards, which is good, but it would actually reduce the scope of standards that we are currently applying. So we are very much in favor of maintaining broader standards, including social and governance aspects. Just regarding your questions around whether it's applicable through asset classes, there are, needs for further, maybe more granular work to make sure that non-listed assets, for example, are, properly treated. Notably, the ESG basic notion for private asset is difficult. Right now, the notion of ESG basic would be to reduce the investment universe based on ESG scores, but this doesn't really exist in listed assets. You don't score all the on private assets. We don't score all the potential private assets and then do a reduction, right? So for private assets, we need a different approach.
Yeah, and again, coming back on the threshold discussion for, I would say, real assets or LTIF, or semi-liquid strategy or real estate strategy that needs to maintain a certain level of liquidity. The question is, how do you calculate the 70% and the liquidity pocket that is required by the strategy?
How and when phase in and phase out, because the way the portfolios are built is we have a deployment phase, right? So it's not that we can establish that percentage on day one.
Okay, so moving to the transition category, which was one of, I would say personally, one of the great addition to the SFDR 2.0 proposal. And I'm moving to Eric on that one. There are currently lots of discussion about the design of this transition category. According to you, how should the criteria be designed to support positive contribution to credible transition objectives?
Well, the most important thing is that it is actually about transition and not about just making the portfolio look better. So no paper decarbonization. We have the PAB for that already. So the Paris line benchmark does that. That's not what we need here. We need a category where we can buy companies that have high emissions today, but that have a credible decarbonization path, and then follow those companies, or even companies that are only at the beginning of that journey, but where we can engage with them and hold their hand, if you will, while they move down in terms of their CO2 intensity. And what's important, I mean, this is complex, of course, to report on. It's not just one number that you can show, I reduced my carbon footprint. So the reporting that you will need to do will be reporting that involves the engagement process that you have. It will need to be reporting at actually the individual holding level, maybe not necessarily for all the companies, but examples, and then the investor should be able to ask for more documentation. Because if you insist that it always, that the portfolio, the fund always has a lower carbon footprint every day, every year, then you can never buy in a company that has a higher footprint. You can never sell the one that has done what you wanted to and then buy one that is earlier in the journey. So that's sort of really the most important thing, that we understand that. And then, of course, there's the question of the credibility. Are these companies is a given company on this transition path. And there, I think we as managers need to document and make public what is the theory of change, if you will, or what is sort of the way that we understand, that we analyze these companies. How do we decide which ones we regard as being in transition or not? We've actually just answered a questionnaire from ESMA on that. They're doing a good review with a look at transition products. So it's not the easiest one to deal with as a manager point of view, but it's super important because when we do customer surveys, it's actually the category that speaks to the most people. So you have some that want something super green right now, then you have some that don't care at all, but most people say that they want to be in the companies while they improve. I think this category has a perspective for great success, actually, if we do it right.
Performance-wise too.
Also.
Let's bring the perspective from Eastern Europe markets. How important is the transition category for your region, Piotr? And can it help SFDR to zero structured capital market and the sustainable investment space in Poland and beyond?
Sure. So apart being part of the Poland Development Fund, I'm also co-founder and member of Polsif, which is affiliated with Eurosif. So I'll try to speak from the perspective of the general market, let's put it this way. So before moving to the transition category, there are just 2 points I wanted to make about the sovereign bonds. So from the less developed sustainable markets in Europe, mostly obviously located in Central Eastern Europe, the corporate bond market is totally underdeveloped. So as you can expect, the green bond market is absolutely non-developed. So it's virtually impossible to create a well-diversified fund. So that's why this adoption of EU general purpose sovereign bonds should be much higher than the 15% floated in certain recommendations, because it will be just impossible for people from this region to really allocate this money. And on top of that, a lot of investment is done through public money as well in the transition. So I think it's just adding to the argument. Moving to the transition category, I really like the comments by Mr. Niedermayer about that. I think it's exactly the dilemma that we have. So in our region, just to give you the context for Poland, for example, I'm coming from Poland, so I'll stick to that. Up to 2030, transition is expected to cost over 200 billion euros. Obviously, there's not enough public money there. On top of that, as we discussed, that's also a great investment opportunity, because if something is to be improved, there is also money to be made, and we are from the investment community. So I think that's why it might be attractive for the clients as well. And we need to strike the balance right. And I just wanted to be kind of specific on 2 examples, because if we try to kind of, figure out the definition, it might be really difficult. However, we have a few examples of certain sectors where definitions are already there. So, for example, district heating is a really important one in certain parts of Europe, all the way from Denmark to Bulgaria. It's like 40% of the heating on average in those countries, including Germany. And a lot of those companies, they need huge capex in the coming years. And there already is a regulation, EED, that describes the exact decarbonization path for this industry. So rather than figuring out something, new, maybe let's stick to the definition that is already there, that, those companies need to align with. And if you're investing in something that is going along the directive, then it means you're in the transition category by rule, right? So you don't need additional kind of information about that, or additional kind of reporting, or additional due diligence, let's put it this way. Then the other one, I think something that we are missing, I think it was raised a few times, is also the social criteria. And then, just sticking to, again, an example, for instance, affordable housing. It's a big thing generally in Europe, right? And we do have certain market standards that are already there, for instance, used by EIB or EBRD. So if there is certain standard, I'm not saying it's perfect, but maybe let's review it rather than figure out something specific for SFDR and use something that is already in place. The market is kind of familiar with it. Maybe let's work around that, right? But trying to be a little bit more kind of, connected to what's already there, rather than, getting SFDR, again, like something separate from the other jurisdictions or other regulations. So I did actually also we do support as well generally some of the comments that were made before, so I won't repeat that. But I think these were, I think, the crucial parts. And just to highlight what's really relevant is about moving the money. So the idea is to move the money to the steel industry, to the district heating industry, to cement industry. So these industries really transition. Maybe they are not yet capable of getting, full green, but the idea of transition is to get, achieve high delta. So I think what Eric was mentioning, right? The fund that is achieving constant improvement in delta is, I think, what we want to kind of, really
At the company level.
At the company
Not
level,
at the fund
exactly.
level,
So constantly finding new investments where the delta is actually the biggest to improve. And on top of that, that should also be connected to potentially, getting some of the better results, both on the impact side and improving the companies along the way. Thank you.
And if I summarize what's being said, I mean, it's really important for us to have dynamic criteria that can be adapted to the market evolution, but also to the different type of strategy or geographies, rather than locking a percentage in the level 1 text. So Louise, again, on this transition category, what is your opinion on the minimum exclusion and safeguards that would be needed for the transition category?
So just coming back to what we were saying before, I do agree that we need to make sure that we don't, we don't leave the social aspects out of our strategies. We don't focus only on the environmental aspects. But for the transition category, I mean, we do need strong safeguards. It's absolutely essential to be credible. We need to focus on that regard, in terms of transition. We need to be forward-looking instead of backward-looking. To that extent, we are very much in line with what the Commission proposed. We think it matches the notion of transition in terms of developing, for example, if I take a concrete example, developing new projects, upstream projects on fossil fuel is not necessary for our future. We already are equipped, right? But the thing is, whether companies have fossil fuel legacy, it's not, it doesn't define their credibility in terms of transition pathway. What's credible is whether they are planning to, phase out those fossil fuel assets and largely invest in their transition. To that regard, focusing on their green capex is one of the criteria that we use to assess the credibility, the quality of their transition plan, but it's only one of the aspects, right? For us, it's more relevant as a minimum safeguard, as a minimum standard, to exclude companies that are developing new projects as a standard, and then use the green capex as one of the criteria to define credibility of transition plan, right? So it's in that way we were more aligned with the Commission proposals than what the Council is proposing.
So let's move now to the other categories, the sustainable and ESG basics. So, Eric, I would like to get your views about the sustainable category. Will it effectively capture the current SFDR 9 so-called products? Will there be any gaps, for instance, between the current application of the do not significantly harm principle and good governance principle that we had on the famous Article 2.19 of SFDR 1 and the proposed criteria for this category?
Yeah, I think at least the way we understand the new Article 9, the sustainable category, is that it's not fully as demanding as the old Article 9. So it's the old Article 9 funds would fit in there, plus what we would call the upper Article 8. So the ones that live up to many of the criteria, but maybe did not have the 90 or 100% sustainable assets in them. So it gives a bit more flexibility, but I think there is investor demand out there, and as MEP Niedermayer said, it's about meeting that demand. And we know from customer surveys again that there is a sizable population of investors who want various degrees of sustainability in their funds. We need to meet that demand, and we need to avoid then that in those funds that we sell them under that name, that there is what I would call nasty stuff, right? There should not be anything that the investor would be surprised about. When the customer buys a fund that says sustainable, we don't want them to come home and look through the holding list and say, what's that doing in there? So to that extent, you need some kind of and whether it's the do no significant harm principles that we already have, they have the advantage that we already know them and have been working with them and have been developing methodology to use them. So I guess the easy way is to just transpose that into the new 9. But any other way that you could think of that would have that minimum hygiene level, that means that we meet the demand of the investor. Really. And I want to, if I have a few minutes here, to say that what's super important about this SFDR2 and the simplification that we're doing here is that it is transposed in the right way into MiFID as well, so that the conversation that the investment advisor has with the client can become much simpler than before. Then the clients can express their wishes, and then we need to give them something that lives up to that, and where they don't get bias remorse, and where we are not accused of greenwashing. That is very clear. This category has this standard, this category has this standard, and of course they cannot all be the same, right? So it's going to be like a stair of various levels of sustainability with this new added theme of transition, which as I said before, I think speaks to a lot of people as well. But also, of course, has to be real transition and cannot be just whatever, as you said. Also, we can't open the door and say everything is transition. I've heard that argument from some people that say, yeah, but every company has to transition at one point, so why can we not own them? That's maybe a bit too easy. So,
and I guess, Julia, from a Finance Watch perspective, you would agree with that.
Definitely.
Okay, that was clear. But how can we avoid that the ESG basics category recreates the confusion that we have around current SFDR Article 8 product?
I think that's probably one of the trickiest bits and pieces when we go through the different categories that are now on the table. And I would say that it is also important to arrive at the situation where not only everything which is not sustainable is kind of transition because we are doing something about it, but also not that everything that which does not fit into 2 other categories can become simply the ESG basic. I think it is not entirely clear at this point in time what this ESG basic category is trying to achieve. And that's also the risk that with the kind of, let's say, different variably combined criteria, we can arrive at the situation where basically the whole investment universe might become eligible for this category because in one or the other indicator, every company can be considered as best in class. So this is why it is also important to understand what are the so-called basic criteria we can put in place so that they still remain credible, and that it is possible also to explain to the investor what this basic ESG stuff which is in it is, if it's not transition and if it's not sustainable. So it should be something which should also bring us closer to the sustainable world. And I would like to mention a few things, maybe that from our perspective, we need to, I wouldn't say sharpen the criteria, but simply define them better, exactly to avoid the situation that I said. And it is also important to keep that in mind, because on top of the categorization as such, we also have the distribution process then in mind. And if we have this category, which is this nice and neat name, ESG basic, we can also end up in the situation where advisors would simply say, well, it's something like green, if you want to be a little bit green, but not too strict, this is what's in for you. And we cannot control, obviously, that, right? Because that relies on every single advisor. And this is why we have a few proposals of how this criteria could be defined, in particular with respect to using the ESG ratings for defining the criteria, but also applying the principle of best in class, which is now included among the possible criteria. So from the perspective of applying ESG ratings, because we do not have a single definition of what an ESG rating is trying to achieve. There are different ways ESG rating providers do their ratings. I think it's very important to say that ESG ratings need to be necessarily double materiality ratings to start with. Because if we're speaking about achieving positive impacts with the whole product categorization, this is essential, right? It's not only about considering the ESG risks, but also considering the ESG impacts from the investor perspective. And then second point regarding the best in class, the so-called best in class principle, which is now part of the regulation. It is also important to pay attention of how this best in class is defined. What I mean is which indicators can be used to say I'm best in class, because as we have it now, let's say like the product manufacturer could say, well, I have this, for example, company that is best in class in terms of gender diversity, and this one is best in class in terms of something else. And if you combine these, because they are not exclusive, then you can end up with a very broad investment universe where it's basically everybody is best in class on something, but could be also still quite harmful on the majority of other things, right? Because we can arrive also at a very narrow definition. So we think that it's important to also stipulate that the definition cannot be like so narrow that we will again have basically the whole investment universe as eligible. And same relates to the narrowing down in the sectors. So if we also take very narrow sectors, we can also have like very harmful sectors as being also fully eligible and then can still have better performance. So these are just a few, I think, specifications that would really help to give some meaning to this basic ESG. And last but not least, obviously, it relates to the broader context of now SFDR, are the mandatory disclosures for all products. So not only the ones that will be categorized in terms of exclusions and principal adverse impacts. This would be also important to show that there is a differentiation at the end between ESG basic and best.
Thank you very much. And this is a nice, I would say, introduction to the next topic, which is product level disclosure. So, Peter, as a large institutional investor with global exposure, how are PAI indicators helpful to you in practice?
I'm sorry to say, but so far they haven't been particularly helpful because our own homebrew of negative impact indicators is so much more refined than the standard PAIs that we see in the SFDR, at least in SFDR 1.0. So, we've got our own screens for all sorts of reasons, environmental, social, corporate governance, OECD guidelines, no significant harm criteria, country policies, it's all in there. So we've got a very firm minimum sustainability standard across the board already. Are we against PAIs? No, not necessarily, but they right now don't do a whole lot for our investment portfolio. Fewer is better. And if we go for, a critical number of PAIs that we can actually work with, it's particularly important that we go for those that allow aggregation at the product level. The entity level is gone already, but I can talk to you about that. But the product level, it is very important that it makes sense. The number you eventually report as a product level principal adverse impact should not be something that people just can't comprehend, because it's like a fruit bowl and you take an average from that, that's hard to communicate. So it's better to go for the ones that your product really is having a real impact on.
I'll switch to Louise on that one, because there are currently discussion in the European Parliament as to whether some PI indicator and which one should be disclosed on a mandatory basis across SFDR category. What are your views about this, and which one would you recommend?
So I very much align with what's just been said as a practitioner. PAI. So PAI in terms of principal adverse impact, super interesting, notion. PAI indicators, as they stand today, very difficult to handle. They can be relevant to show compliance, portfolio level compliance to the minimum requirements, right? If you use exposure PAI, or, that's what we say is, the PAI indicators that shows your exposure to fossil fuel, for example, is, it's actionable because it shows whether or not I match my promise, right? with some need for granularity, because right now fossil fuel exposure is just yes, no. So it doesn't really give a granular view, and it doesn't notably express the role of each actor in the value chain. You know, I was talking about upstream fossil fuel, upstream projects that are not required anymore, that are not necessary. Gas distribution are still relevant in scientific scenarios like IPCC and IEA, right? So, you know, we should differentiate that and maybe clarify those PAI indicators in terms of exposure to some controversial or excluded activities. Intensity PAIs like pollution or, you know, water usage, very difficult to use. It's absolute number. No one really knows what's the, you know, average standard per geography, per industry. And also one should understand that a reduction of an intensity PAI from already a very low level doesn't really mean that you've brought additionality, right? So we would recognize the necessity to maintain some PAIs indicators, but focusing on those that can be actionable, can be understandable, as long as they also match the intentionality. I think that's what also was related, the intentionality of the fund, right? So matching the strategy, if it's a social strategy or environmental strategy. Some PAI indicators are also, we believe, not really focusing on the right matter. For example, feminization of the board. It's interesting, but it's actually more important to to bring feminization in the executive suite, and it's where the level of feminization remains very low. So, you know, some PAI indicators should be reconsidered. But overall, I think, you know, the most important thing that I would like to underline is that PAI indicators will show how we comply to our minimum requirements. They will not necessarily show our contribution, our positive impact. If, you know, I have portfolios that are dedicated to investing in climate solutions, those climate solutions are developed by industrials. Industrials have major carbon footprints. So my scope 1, 2, 3 intensity will be high and will probably get higher and higher. But my scope 4, the avoided emissions, are also going to be higher and higher. And those are what we desire, right? So the key here is to combine PAI indicators with other indicators that show the performance.
And I'm turning to Piotr because there is a very big discussion about PAI in the context of passive strategy. Do you think they are useful for passive strategy?
Indeed, in my previous life, I was in another asset management company where we were designing and creating a lot of passive funds, including Article 8 and 9. And I think the issue is similar to what was already described. I think generally fewer PAIs is perhaps better, but also that can be easily compared, and we can easily find peer groups because, you know, in the passive, you need to somehow justify, you know, the position of the specific companies. So you can, for instance, opt for, I don't know, going for the ones which are top quartile in certain PAIs, etc. But they need to be comparable. So you need to compare it on the sectoral level. But one additional point that I would like to make is again related to the fact that in, let's say, less developed markets, it's going to be extremely difficult. So this is again the experience that is in the Central Eastern European market, that actually the sustainable money is flowing out of the region because it's very easy to, let's say, construct a fund that is based on MSCI index that is pan-European, which is mostly Western European companies, rather than investing where the actual need is in the local space. And it's also related because there are so few reporting companies, basically. And if they are reporting, you know, they are not reporting in full. So getting this peer analysis is extremely difficult. On top of that, I think there is additional issue which is related to the fact that maybe not necessarily passive, but generally related to SMEs. So SMEs will get a bit of leeway in terms of what they will be reporting. So we need to make sure that the funds that invest in SMEs will be allowed to base on those limited, let's say, limited number of information or data points as well, so they can justify that they are also doing something credible. And again, I believe that the general intention is to move money towards SMEs as well, rather than just pushing them towards, you know, the big companies with huge reports and that are able to spend a lot of money on getting those prepared by external advisors.
Yeah, thank you. It's now time for us to move to communication to investors. Let's start with retail investors. So Julia, how can SFDR 2.0 criteria and disclosure be effectively translated in processes to assess client sustainability preference? What do retail client and the frontline financial advisors who guide them actually need from a product disclosure to make an informed choice?
That's a great question. I think first what retail clients need is to understand how the preferences are being asked about. Right? So what we would expect that after the SFDR 2 is in place, that the way the clients are being asked about those preferences is aligned with the product categories, so that they can somehow relate to what the objectives of the products are, which I think is really, really difficult at the moment. And also from the work of the colleagues we used to work in this field, we know that very often kind of people are being rushed through that process without really understanding of what those criteria would mean or what their investment would do, which of course comes on top of the existing issues with SFDR. So here, basically, the first thing would be to have these product categories credible and reliable and clear and understandable, as like all the discussion goes in that direction, including making sure that these definitions are sufficiently robust, but also that we do not have, let's say, exclusions which are very hard for people to understand. Like, for example, if we had some fossil fuels in sustainable category, with some kind of clauses that they would invest a little bit into phase out, I think that would be really difficult for people to understand. So I think getting clarity there would be the first step, including, as I previously said, on the ESG basic criteria category, sorry. Then the second thing would also to have mandatory disclosures for all the products, so not only the categorized ones, again, so that the retail investors could compare and could understand, like, what is this product which is not categorized doing, and that should also be part of the product disclosure. Then there is I think the issue that we would have with retail investors' preferences and the definition of sustainability products as they are in the SFDR. I think we all know that not all the possible options or instruments in which people invest are captured by the definition of the sustainable product in SFDR, and this remains an issue, and it will be remaining an issue in the distribution process. So one of the possible solutions here could be also that in the process of distribution, there would be a possibility to categorize for the purposes of constructing retail investment portfolios, the so-called managed portfolios, but also the so-called advice portfolios. So let's say bunches of investment on which people receive regular advice. Then there is, of course, an element about making sure that the product disclosures are also well aligned with what will be done again in the SFDR and how the preferences will be considered. So the key information documents should include product categorization and should also include the mandatory disclosures for all the products, so that it's also clear and transparent. One last point that I would mention is an idea that we've been entertaining and working on, is to also provide a possibility for the people to understand that the products categorized as sustainable can be sustainable to a different degree, and that this could be also done then later post SFDR to see if we could construct some kind of a summarized indicator for the market to see like how sustainable the product is, which would allow, I think, also give an incentive for the product manufacturers also to, let's say, highlight their efforts in terms of achieving different levels of sustainability without putting at a disadvantage, let's say, those who might be, let's say, less sustainable compared to those who might want to differentiate themselves to be more sustainable.
Thank you, Julia. There was a question, I think, earlier on about potential opt-out for professional investors. Bearing in mind that very often retail investors invest through funds of funds who are themselves professional investors, what would be the potential implication in terms of retail investor protection of these opt-out for professional investors?
Yeah, thanks for this also question. I didn't mention it explicitly. Yes, we think it's also very important that professional investors are exactly for the purposes of being able to construct fund of funds. Because obviously for those who are providers of fund of funds, manufacturers of fund of funds, it's essential to have the information on the underlying funds and not being skewed to only, let's say, selecting funds of manufactured by the same provider. I think there is also an important point about making sure that the disclosure of the percentage of contribution is also there, so that in the process of constructing fund of funds, we do not lose this percentage, right? So that we are able to say, okay, if a fund invests only 70% into the sustainable activities, that the fund of fund considers that it's only 70% and 100%, right? So that it does not lead to an inadvertent greenwashing, even let's say by design of the regulation and not by the will of the product manufacturer. So yes, that I think would be our view on this.
And there was also one question raised earlier on about the availability of data, which has always been a nightmare for asset managers and asset owners, and have been even amplified with the decrease in scope on CSRD. So increasing the reliability of data provided by data estimated by data provider. Eric, do you want to comment on that one?
Yes. And this is maybe an unpopular opinion, and to the question from MEP Gerbrandy before, should we regulate the data providers more? And when I say I have maybe an unpopular opinion, is that I've never been as worried about this lack of data problem, because if we as asset managers want to find out, then we can contact the company, we can look through whatever they have published. So yes, a lot of companies, you get the data directly from the providers, but you have to also, as a manager, be responsible for looking through that data, testing that data, determining whether you think it's credible. And in the end, we are the ones responsible for fulfilling the regulation. And if we can't get it anywhere else, okay, so there are some companies where there is no data at all. Probably if the company does not disclose anything, then it's likely that it's not sustainable. At least I would not make that claim. But coming back to whether we need more regulation, I think that would not be my first priority on the data provider side, because there are lots of professional data providers, large ones, small ones, new ones popping up all the time. If you want specialty data on gender, for example, there are a couple that you can go to. If you want specialty data on something else, physical climate risk, for instance, you can go to another provider. And part of what we do is to judge those providers against each other for the quality and for the coverage of what they provide. And I don't want to sound flippant here, but we don't need the help of the regulator for that. we can do that.
But I guess the correct route or the ideal route would be to continue to support and encourage companies to measure and report the data.
Yeah. And maybe one last thing. So when it comes to ESG ratings, which have also been the object of a lot of sort of wishes to regulate, I think we need to recognize that an ESG rating is an art as much as a science, right? They are defined in different ways. They are trying to do different things. They rely and weight underlying data points in different ways. So insisting that they should all be the same, that just, at least from our perspective, doesn't make very much sense.
I think it's now time for us to end the panel and to start the Q&A session. Are there any questions from the floor? Or I would say, Pierre,
There are many online questions focusing on the categories and criteria. So I think the panelists already discussed these a lot. I think one interesting question that we had also as part of the registration process was on the fund of funds and how they should be used in the.
Yes, can I answer that?
Yeah.
So there's one very technical issue around funds of funds, which it may not be the material of level 1 regulation, I don't know, but it's very important that we don't get it wrong. And that is a lot of distributors of investment products, when they construct a whole portfolio, a balanced portfolio for a client, they do it via funds of funds. So they buy funds from different providers, or they use their own internal ones, and then they wrap them into one fund. Now, if we insist that for an Article 9 or 7 or 8 fund of fund, that every underlying product has to also have that labeling, then we are doing ourselves a disservice, and we're making it very, very difficult. You had?
No. If I can ask.
Okay. And just so I'm not misunderstood here. I think what is needed is exactly what was said before. We need to do the X-ray. So when I do a fund of fund and I want to classify as 9, it should not be because the underlying ones are 9. It should be because I can X-ray the holdings of all of the funds I have underneath, and I can say that they together fulfill the criteria. Because otherwise you get this mix where one has 70%, one has 75, one has 80. What is actually what I'm getting in the end? So I know it's technical, but it's very, very important. And the easy way, of course, is to say, I want to do an 8, then all the underlying have to be 8. But you're not certain that the client actually gets what they want. And you're making it very difficult for yourself as a fund of fund manager also to live up to what you're promising. So please let us X-ray the entire collected holdings of the underlying funds when we look at the fund of funds.
Certain that the client would get what they want if indeed all the underlying funds are, let's say, Article 8. What could be an example of where then the outcome or the profile, let's say, of the fund of funds is different from the underlying, if the underlying funds indeed do all have?
If they exactly all have, then yes. But if you have a situation where you, for example, have government bonds in one of them, and then not in the other ones, and then it becomes very hard to see exactly what is it, right? So you want to be able to show, and you should have to show what is the collective holding of all the underlying. Yeah.
May I ask 2 questions? The first, I guess one of you expressed a kind of bit of skepticism on entity level reporting that was dropped by the Commission and also by the Council. But there is also argument that it's not so difficult to aggregate the data on the entity level. So I would like to understand how you see that. And also there is a question how they are represented. Maybe they could be collected, but are they representative? And the second, I guess, Derek, you specifically talk about a transitional category, the way how I would like to see that, but it's very difficult how to put it into the regulation. It must be sufficiently clear to see who is in and who is out. So I wonder if you have some specific idea how to develop this idea into something really specific that can be inserted.
Again, on the entity level, because we do listed and private assets, we can aggregate, but the methodologies are very different. The level of coverage of, for example, the PAI indicators for listed assets, it's very difficult. We have to contact every project. Sometimes it's very small projects. They don't even have, it's not even relevant for them, some of the indicators that we have to use. And then we aggregate that, and it shows nothing. It's not that we can't do it. It's just, it's not usable for anyone, really. So it's a lot of work for nothing. So we would rather focus on something else. And just...
But that doesn't mean that we should be skipping entity level disclosure. It's
absolutely,
it's the indicator
exactly.
that is a challenge, but the policies is really important.
Exactly. And if I just can add something, because we were talking about fund of fund, but there's also, other types of products like the passive portfolios that reflect PAB criteria, Paris Aligned Benchmark. we would be in favor of having a fair set of standards for qualifying as a article, as a sustainable or transition strategy. Not just matching the minimum requirements, but also, the eligibility criteria.
And the other question?
Was a transition.
Yes. So
One follow-up question, just while we're on this, and then we go to the transit. I'm
sure,
under the
sure.
control, but just while we're on this, but at entity level for the panelists, because I understand the concern about PAI, but then in terms of policies or anything else, what would you find useful, necessary to disclose at entity level? What could help you, or what could be?
I mean, if there are indicators that are relevant, it's, back to what we were saying earlier on PAI, it's the PAI indicators that show that we match the common subset of minimum standards, right? So excluded activities, of course, this should be reported transparently. For a firm that does ESG basics to sustainable, we should calibrate those indicators to a level that's relevant transversally. And that's the most difficult part, I think.
Engagement policies as well.
Of course,
How you engage with the underlying company to achieve the goal.
Yes. That's more on the intentionality. Indeed, we have an obligation of means. So what does it mean, this obligation of means? What did we invest? How many people? How many time? How did we calibrate our strategies and processes to organize, to maximize our chances to have impact, real world impact? That's a key aspect.
The engagement for listed and due diligence for the non-listed assets.
If I may, what you just said, but there's a share of each product in each category.
Yes.
To have an idea of this, I have 50% of my funds that are Article 6.
Yes.
For instance, gives a good overview to the end investor return.
On the transition question.
yes. So on the transition and how you substantiate. So I think actually in the proposal from the Commission there was something about substantiating the approach you use to determine whether something is a transition company or not. And I think that there's something called the Net Zero Investment Framework, which is enough of a market standard that I think actually the regulation could refer to it directly as one way of doing it. There are the other frameworks that Piotr mentioned. So wherever there are frameworks, we have the taxonomy, we have other ways of basically referring to the performance of a company to any one of those frameworks. And there's a UK transition framework and so on. So as long as you can show that we're doing it according to this methodology, or you have developed your own, but then you need to lay out what it is. I think that's the important part. And not all the transition products are going to be the same. So some will refer more to one framework. Some will be pure net zero investment framework, NZIF. Others will maybe be more to if it's a real estate product, then obviously there are standards in real estate that you can use. But I think the necessary or the most important part is that you can declare to your investor that this is the methodology that
to capture the delta, to capture the difference over time.
Yeah, and that's also, there is not one fits all, because it's totally different if you're sitting on a listed fund invested in listed assets or real assets. I mean, in a real estate fund, for instance, you will be applying SBTI scenarios or current fast rate to determine what is your investment towards decarbonization. If it's in private assets, it really depends. If you're sitting on renewable energy product, it's a totally different animals. But what is important is to have a methodology to actually calculate, to set the targets and to calculate whether you are delivering the carbon reduction vis-a-vis of what was the objective.
And that methodology has to be well enough described to the investor that they can tell whether something belongs there or not. I mean, so if there is a holding in your portfolio which does not fulfill any of the things you have said that they should fulfill to be, then there's something wrong with them. Then in the end, the local FSA should come after you, but the investor should be able to see that, to compare the holding list and say, do I think that this corresponds with the frameworks that this asset manager say they use?
You had a question?
Just add on this one. I think there is a kind of a point with the transition category that we still, right, we are kind of back to the discussion about what is a credible transition path and what is a credible transition plan that we had in the CS-DDD, and then the transition plan requirement was not there anymore. And I think there is still a need to have a standard on this. It was reference to certain existing policies, industry standards, but there is a clear need to have a kind of a credible transition path as a baseline for this category, with transition plans being the tool for that, and also with engagement being it for the investment managers to exercise that impact and to achieve that delta. So I think that there also should be a reference, if we are speaking about a credible transition plan, a reference to the compatibility with the Paris trajectory. And it can be different for each industry. I think it's the same as the discussion around industry pathways, and a reliance on existing policies is very much essential. And I think it's great to hear that there are sectors where it's already possible. But I do think that that needs to be like the line criterion, so that again, there is at least a baseline level of credibility and guarantee that the delta will indeed exist over time.
In terms of point of reference, we already massively use the EU taxonomy. It would be great that there are references that stand to the EU taxonomy if we wanted to continue as a point of reference. But net zero investment framework, it's actionable on nature. We can all work on a credible way to assess nature transition plan. What about the social aspects? It's not in the taxonomy. There's no reference. There's no framework that exists. But it's not like we are fighting against climate change for nothing. It's actually for population. So we need a way to make sure that the social topics remain possible in the transition investment and in sustainable investment.
There is a lot of motivation in the panel on that question.
Yeah, but you all seem to agree on that.
Yeah.
You had one question, or have we addressed it in a...
I actually have two.
Okay.
If there's space for that, and thanks already for the inputs. If I understood correctly, you all think the 70% threshold is the right one. To me, it's quite low, maybe especially for the dark green category. So it could be interesting to hear if you see a potential for diversification among the three categories, also reflecting that they have different aims. And then the second question would be on the ESG basics. I share the risk that this will just open the door for greenwashing, and I think to me it's quite unclear what should be the aim of the ESG basics. So it could be interesting to hear how you, where do you see the merits of this category?
Yeah.
So one very quick answer to the 70% potentially not being high enough. I think it's important to remember that especially in the sustainable category, the last 30% cannot be whatever. They still have to fulfill, in the case of that category, the PAB exclusions. Right. And if you also have, as we discussed at the very beginning, some kind of something like the do no significant harm, or some kind of sort of minimum hygiene level going across the social and the other categories, or the other subjects that we deal with here, then I don't think it's a problem that there is 30% that doesn't sort of align directly what the fund says it's going to do, as long as it can be considered neutral in the sense that it's not something that harms. And from a technical point of view, when you manage a fund, the current Article 9, that 90% is very, very high and very hard to do. So it's good to get a bit of air so that you can put in something that is there for risk management purposes, maybe, as long as you make sure that it's not, again, something super nasty that the client would say, what's that? Yeah.
Particularly on asset class where you need to have a certain pocket of liquidity in the investment strategy.
Yeah.
Even in listed equity, considering the size of mega capitalization today, it's, you know, we need some leeway to diversify, but it's in maintaining the standards. But
And also it's a minimum, right? So when you're managing a fund, you would never go, you know, on the border. You would be
always
like,
have
you
more.
have a buffer. So effectively you say 70 for the, you know, person doing the fund, it's 75 that they need to keep, you know, more or less,
Or
right?
more.
At minimum, right? Or more, obviously, then you can diversify yourself.
But the funds we have today, where the limit is minimum 50%, they typically are around 70 actually. But the portfolio manager needs a bit of space to be able to trade and not have to look every time I'm going over my limit. So,
But I think, you know, what is important, as you said, is really what are the safeguards applied to the remaining, up to 30% pockets.
But can I ask?
no, just to that, to your points of, you know, there's a discussion around the multiplying factor possibility to match the 70%. I mean, the 70% should remain credible and easy to understand. And there are risks with that notion of a multiplying factor that it's actually easier to match. We would be in favor of, you know, having a stringent approach to that 70%.
but then to your question of having different levels, I mean, for the sustainable, is it the ESG basics, you could have 50, for instance. So that you get that stair where the customer can decide how much do I want. So if you had 50 at the bottom, then you have the transition, which is like a special one, and then you have the 70 for the sustainable, so that you get the difference between the two.
I was thinking 190 and 70.
Yeah, but
110.
There was two remaining questions. Yeah.
Yeah, two different ones, but the first was on engagement and maybe specifically for Pete and maybe Piotr also from this more sort of long-term perspective. If you could just share a little bit on your, let's say, some best practice on engagement, or from your perspective, what is useful, what is not, and in terms of disclosures, what is useful and what is not, for the purposes of what we're doing here.
Yeah. Well, engagement in private markets is typically done at the very beginning, right? This is like a pre-contractual type of engagement or involvement you've got. In liquid markets, it's more difficult, you know, and it's just as much an art as a science, I must admit, because it's not that we have a huge stick to wield. If you are PGM, on average, we own not even a 0.5 percentage point of a listed company. So you need to team up with other investors now, wherever possible and allowed, which is, again, you know, something that plays out in the US right now. And then you need to have, you know, patience and perseverance, because this is not the sort of thing that happens overnight. Typically, engagement is on negative impact, which we feel, some investors feel at least, that it will come back as financial risk eventually. So anything that's above the minimum sustainability standard, otherwise we can't invest in it at all. There's plenty of trouble above that standard. That is negative impact, potentially financial risk. That's where we try to engage on, best with other investors. And what is that in our practice? You know, it's human rights, labor rights, climate, biodiversity. These are big items on that list of engagement issues. And in liquid markets, it's pretty much the only thing. Active ownership also includes voting, obviously, but engagement plus voting, that's all you got.
But if we want to capture that properly here, and if we want to make sure that we don't look back in a few years and people accuse us of this felt very nice, but it amounted to box ticking. There's so many assets under management in certain funds that you can't possibly engage with all of them, at least not if you want to have impact. Then what would be a useful?
Maybe others can chip in, but you know, in my opinion, it's be selective. So know what you own and know where your priorities lie. And second is, just as much as for the transition category, establish a baseline and a series of steps you want to lead the company through or to. So know what you want, know where you start, and monitor the progress.
But from a policymaker's perspective, that would then mean requiring disclosure on engagement policies where the description of that disclosure is quite detailed.
Yes.
We already do that.
We have that.
On
That exists,
asset
yeah.
management side. We do a lot of engagement on the lowest ESG scores, but also on companies where we think, it's those companies are from high stake sectors and their transition plan is not mature, right? So what I would say is, yes, you would need to ask transparency around, but I already mentioned it, but the means that how the targets are selected, targets for engagement, or how are the engagement scenario built? Are they time bound? Is there a clear escalation process? And in the report, we should report also on, the progress and escalation, where we stand in the escalation process, right? There should be a governance, right, for the cases where we escalate, because at some point, a conclusion has to be made. And, within this process somewhere, if we want the engagement strategy to be credible, there needs to be a notion of likeliness of success, right? Can we actually engage with this company? Is this company actually open to it? Are there mechanisms? Is the company going to bring additionality if I engage with it, or is it just cosmetic? What do we call an engagement? Is it just sending an email asking for transparency, or is it actually a project to have real world change? I would say we should refrain from claiming direct impact, specifically in the listed segment, where a lot of investors engage and regulators play a strong role, etc. So, I wouldn't claim impact, but I would claim influence. So, that's maybe where.
And just to because I find this really interesting, but because I'm familiar with most of these things, but it's very good that you say them again. This is very useful, but to capture them from a policy perspective in a way that would reward those who really engage in good faith and who go that extra mile, right? Who are not doing box ticking. We're not thinking, well, from a PR perspective, we need to say that we sent the email. But how do I? Because if we make in the legislation, if we say we want to see your policy, you've got to disclose it, and this has got to be in it. Then Ludek's colleagues are going to tell me that the S&D is crazy and this is very burdensome, and absolutely not.
Once again, most of the investors do report already. There are references emerging, one in France from the French SIF, but so there are also other references that you can.
Maybe one way of solving that is to say that it's at the product level, so especially to the transition category again, where it's super relevant, but also if you have an new Article 9 products, you should disclose what engagement do you do. Maybe even what percentage of the portfolio is engaged at a given point in time, and then your policy, right? So, and then those firms who don't want to play in that space can then choose not to disclose. I think that's maybe the way of.
But I think the most interesting reporting that I had seen prior to SFDR were when the asset manager is reporting at product level the actual. I would say engagement activities that took place on certain companies.
Yes and no, because in general, we try to leverage all our asset under management have weight, and we also join forces. So it's not like we engage on behalf of one portfolio. But I mean, it would be relevant to say what was the share of the portfolio's AUM or companies that should have been prioritized. And among those, what's the percentage that have been covered, that have been addressed, and then report on success, right?
So maybe just adding, I think there are two ways of approaching this, or a mix of two. So either you're focusing on outliers and you are clearly saying what do you do and why do you kind of select the ones that are somehow, kind of red flags in certain points of view, or you are kind of having this system level approach, right? So I think the system level investing approach is really something that you can capture through this general policy where you actually either you set something minimum and you're always following what you are doing if you're seeing something that is outlying from there, or you are trying, actively to improve the system in a way. This beta activism, whatever, this sort of notion. But I think what is important from your point of view is that you are saying what you are doing, right? Like you're saying we are just looking at the very outliers and we are focusing on them, and we have a kind of policy that we first send an email, then we do a meeting, and then kind of we do something more, etc., etc. But there is a path, and this is something how I imagine everybody should have somewhere. On you are more on the general side, and you have the system level approach where you clearly say what do. You set the minimum standard that you follow everywhere. You see something that is not fitting the standard, then you act on. You are actively doing something. That's
I'm sorry, but we have a hard stop at 2, and we still have. We need to save time for the concluding remark from Lara Wolters and Kina-Marie Peter-Hansen.
I just took up quite some time with my questions, so I'm quite happy for Kira to. I'm quite happy for Kira if you're okay with it to take it, because we're 4 minutes to the hour even. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, first of all, thank you for joining us today, and also for organizing this. I think we got a lot of input, speaking on behalf of all of us, and I think it's quite clear to show that we all want a credible SFDR revision. We want a legislation that serves retail investors, that is easy to manage, and that is also delivering on the aims of the Green Deal. And I think even though we have diverging views, I think we will manage this together. Yeah.
I wanted to.
I don't know if there's anything in particular. I've never written as many notes in my life. I think I hope I'll still understand them afterwards. But I really thought it was fascinating. There were many things that I'd heard before, which I think is a good sign, because it means that at some point you reach some kind of consensus. But there were also things that I hadn't heard before. Or that I really think deserve further thought. So I think that one of the things that for us in particular is interesting is in this transition category to make sure that we capture the sort of movement, and for instance reflecting on what does movement mean, and is movement going from, let's say, a very polluting company to someone that's only to something that's only half as polluting, but still a lot more polluting than some others out there that might only be making marginal gains at some point. What does that mean for those transition funds and how we capture them? So things like that, or the funds of funds, I think there's a lot of food for thought here. I think that we'll have to have a little bit of follow-up, because there's still some things that we didn't have time for today, but I think all of this is excellent timing with our next negotiation on Tuesday. And I have a feeling that we're going to be able to do justice both to the impact that we want to see and the usability of these funds after the previous experience that you talked about so candidly. So thank you very much. And I don't know if we should go back one more time to our rapporteur or not.
Well, only to echo what you've been saying. So many thanks for this meeting. One of the questions that pops up during these kind of discussions is, yes, but what does it mean for real life? Like the engagement, you said it's very difficult to talk about real impact, but you engage to have impact. So either this company is changing its behavior, or you withdraw your investment because you're not happy anymore. If you talk about engagement,
my point was just I don't want to claim solely me as one asset manager, the whole impact.
It's very, very important. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's very important not to create the the image that you engage in. If you don't get what you want, then you sell. That's not how it works. It's a long-term process. You don't always get what
No,
you want.
that's what I mean. But
Yes.
you engage because you see
You try to have
the
impact.
direction of a company going into the wrong direction. So you start engaging. If you
Yes.
see that it's not helping,
Yes.
then you might.
And if it's a product that is sold as an engagement product, a transition product, and the company keeps going the wrong direction, then you should sell it.
Yeah.
Yes, but not on the first day, not because I didn't reach my
No, that's
target.
what I meant.
And because, I'm just nervous because sometimes in regulation it can become very, and this is fluffy.
Yeah, we'll introduce that 1 week notice.
Perfect. Then
So-
we did our job.
So many thanks, very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thanks a lot for hosting us today, and we are at your disposal to go to dig further into some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm glad you made it finally.
I was so afraid. I think